Hello, everybody. The DUI guy is back here with Marissa Feel. Say hi, Marissa.
Hi.
We are going to be talking about DUIs and their impact on people's ability to travel into Canada. Now, Marissa Feel is with FW Canada and she practices in Canada. And she is going to be describing the the process of getting DUIs expunged, their effects on traveling into Canada, and all of that good stuff. So, Marissa, you have the seat.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to your followers and subscribers about this issue because it does come up a lot. So the general rule, and I'll just jump right in, is that a DUI makes you inadmissible to Canada. That means that you cannot travel to Canada after a DUI conviction. And I say conviction because having a pending charge or having a DUI that's been expunged puts you in a totally different category, and we can talk about those categories too. But for the general person, having a DUI conviction is going to make you inadmissible to Canada. And I don't know if you've heard, but back in December of 2018, Canada changed its DUI laws. And that was a result of a political compromise that was set into place because Canada legalized marijuana. So, in order to try and keep the roads as safe as possible after legalizing marijuana, we changed our impaired driving laws to make an impaired driving offense a much more serious conviction. And the reason I mention this is because when Canada is trying to figure out whether you're going to be allowed in or not, they're looking at how is the law classified in Canada. So they don't care if it's a misdemeanor or a felony or anything in the United States or in the place where it happened. They only care about how severe is this offense in Canada. And since December 2018, it's become a lot more of a serious offense, which makes it harder to travel, harder to get waivers, and actually creates a situation where if you have a DUI, unless you apply for this type of waiver or apply for an expungement, you're never allowed to travel to Canada again, which is a pretty serious consequence.
Right.
So you and I discussed before that it's really difficult to plead down a DUI because that's what a lot of people think of. They're like, oh, well, I've been charged with this DUI and how am I going to do this? I have business in Canada or I have family in Canada or, a lot of flights going overseas, leave from Canada or have a stopover in Canada. What am I going to do? And you had talked to me about the how really difficult it is to plead down a DUI. Do you want to mention those kinds of cases? Because a lot of people think of that as a way to overcome inadmissibility, but from what I
Sure.
understand, that's not possible.
Sure. Yeah. I get a lot of calls, and almost universally, individuals will ask, potential clients will ask me right off the bat, can we get my DUI dismissed? Can we get my DUI amended? And of course, the answer that I always give is it depends. I don't know until I look at all the issues that we have. And it's not easy to do in Kentucky. Now, we have been successful because we specialize in this type of law so that we know what to look for. And if we find it, then we're oftentimes successful because police do make a lot of mistakes, and prosecutors are more open to negotiation when they realize that their case may not be as strong as they had originally thought. But without us putting in the work, of course, there's no discussion that may even begin for the most part.
Right.
But if we find those issues, then absolutely we can plead the DUIs down. And how
Okay.
does that affect if a DUI is originally charged as a DUI but is later amended down to something else? Does that affect the person's entry into Canada?
Absolutely. So Canada is only, like I said, looking at the conviction. And in some cases, They can also look at the offense, and if a person admits to committing the offense, that can also be used against them at the Canadian border. But usually you're looking at what were you ultimately convicted of. So because Canada respects the rule of law and respects people's rights to a free and fair trial, if you are arrested or charged with something, but you were ultimately not found guilty of that offense, then it's not held against you when you want to travel to Canada. If you don't receive a full acquittal, if you end up pleading to something else, then we would have to look at what that something else is and make sure that that's not an offense that makes you inadmissible to Canada. Because I can tell you that generally speaking, almost all driving related offenses that involve alcohol or drugs are going to make you inadmissible in some way, even if it is a lesser offense than a DUI. So usually when someone is eligible to plead down, we're trying to look as far away from driving offenses as possible, looking in like the disorderly conduct sort of area of the law to see if we can use that, because that would be something that would make a person inadmissible to Canada.
So even if the offense originally charged as a DUI, one of the most common amendments that we get is to either reckless or careless driving.
Right.
So that would still potentially put a huge hindrance on their ability to travel into Canada.
Absolutely. We have an offense in our criminal code. We have one criminal code for all of Canada. It's unlike the United States where you guys have one state by state,
Lucky.
one for everybody. And we have an offense called dangerous operation of a motor vehicle, which says that anyone who does anything that could be dangerous to a person, the public, or the roadway is guilty of an offense. And that offense actually has the same type of punishment and sentencing as a DUI. So for Canadian immigration purposes, for the purposes of traveling across the border, whether you get a DUI or whether you get a failure to blow or whether you get a careless or dangerous operation of a motor vehicle, all of those things are going to make you inadmissible in the exact same way. So there's no Canadian reason to accept that kind of plea. There might be a reason domestically for your clients to do that, but for the purposes of traveling to Canada, it makes no difference.
Interesting.
Yeah. So let's say your client is convicted of DUI or one of those other offenses that we discussed. The way that it works is that you're technically inadmissible, but you could apply for what's called a temporary resident permit. It's a permit that allows you to come temporarily to Canada for a specific purpose for a specific period of time. So for example, I represent a lot of airline pilots. So they receive a DUI, but their employer, the airline, requires that they be able to travel into Canada on a weekly basis or whatever. Every Monday they have a route that goes to Canada. The employer prepares a letter, gives it to me. I put together a package and I request that the Canadian government grant this person a temporary permit that's valid because this person has an economic and employment reason to travel to Canada. Usually they are looking for something that's economic in nature and not just simply, I want to go to a bachelor party or I want to go fishing or I want to go skiing or something like that. It's usually related to business, but sometimes it could be related to family. There's a funeral, somebody's sick, I have a wedding, those types of things. They are given out for those reasons. And it's usually limited in time as well. So the maximum that you could possibly get is 3 years on one of those permits. Usually we don't see 3 years because that's the absolute maximum. Usually we're seeing 6 months, 1 year, and then the person can renew it until they become eligible for an expungement. The expungement is similar to Kentucky. In Canada, if you have a conviction and then the sentence was completed more than 5 years ago, so it's not even just the conviction date. You have to have completed the community service, paid all the fines, or done be complete with the probation. If 5 years have passed from that date, you're eligible for an expungement that will clear your record just for the purposes of traveling to Canada. So if a person wants an expungement for other reasons, they can contact you. But for my purposes, if a person is 5 years out, they're eligible for a process called criminal rehabilitation, which is what we call the Canadian expungement. And then once a person goes through that, they clear their record permanently so long as they don't reoffend. Because if they reoffend, then it goes back to square one and they will have to apply for another expungement and include their old offense in that expungement request when they do it again. So a person has a couple of options when they're a few years out from their conviction. They can either look to their attorney like yourself and try and get it expunged locally so that it doesn't show up on their record, or they can contact someone like me and have it expunged at least for Canadian purposes. And if someone doesn't qualify for the expungement in Kentucky, but they might qualify in Canada, not qualifying for the Kentucky expungement doesn't in any way influence their ability to get the Canadian expungement.
That was my next question, because our expungement statute used to be 5 years, but our look-back window changed from 5 years to 10 years, and that in turn changed the expungement statute. So an individual getting convicted of a DUI today is only going to be eligible to expunge it in Kentucky 10 years from today in 2029, but they would still be able to move for expungement for purposes of entering into Canada in 2024.
Exactly. And one of the things that people often ask me is like, how does Canada even know? Like, how do they know how long it's been, or, that I even have something on their record? So I did want to briefly, you mentioned that in this video. When a person travels to Canada in any way, if you fly in, if you drive through the border, if you come through on a cruise or another kind of boat, at all Canadian ports of entry, the officers at the little booths that you go to when you arrive have a little scanning machine, and they can hold up your passport or your enhanced driver's license to this little machine, and that machine actually pulls up your entire record via the FBI's database, which shows everything going back to your 18th birthday. So what we often do with people who have like old convictions or who aren't exactly sure what's on their record, one of the first steps that we do in my office is have an FBI background check done so that we can see exactly what the Canadian government will see when you show up at the Canadian border. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of people don't know that the FBI often has incomplete information. So often it's not just enough to show up there and be like, well, they know about it already. I'm just, there's nothing more for me to do. We still do have to provide court records and information about when the fines were paid, what kind of sentencing was involved. And that's why it's really important for me to work with attorneys like yourself to help their clients get all their information so that they have all of that to be able to show an officer when they arrive. So that's how people know. And I will caution people that if you're ever asked when you arrive in Canada, it's because the officer already knows the answer is yes. So officers don't just go up to people being like, hey, have you ever been arrested for DUI? Or hey, have you ever been pulled over for impaired driving? They don't ask that unless you actually have something on their record and they can already see it. So it is well worthwhile to be honest, because like I said, if they're asking the question, they already know the answer.
Is it possible for an individual to have a DUI on their record that's less than 5 years, so they're not eligible for expungement, but still kind of squeeze through and having the officer not notice, especially if you're driving through and you're just right then and there?
Absolutely. So one of the interesting things that people don't consider or think about is that often when you're traveling through Canada on an airline or on a cruise ship or things like that, those airlines and cruise lines are required to provide passenger manifests to the Canadian government with all the lists of the passengers and their passport numbers and dates of birth, so that the Canadian government can actually run everybody through their database before they even get to Canada. So often when you're flying or arriving by ship, it's really hard to go unnoticed because they're often checking those lists well before you arrive. When you drive, obviously nobody knows you're coming. You're just like pulling up and this is the first time that they're seeing you. And oftentimes there's a really long line of cars and the officer doesn't want to wait to scan the actual passport. So they just look at the passport and they say, oh, looks like you. What are you doing in Canada? I'm coming to go fishing. Excellent. Have a nice day. And they don't even look it up because it takes a minute or two for the system to pull up that information. And so I often have people who are like, I traveled to Canada for many, many years. This never came up. And all of a sudden, I was stopped. I will say that since September 11th, Canada got a lot better screening technologies and a lot more widely available screening technologies. So there were some land borders that didn't even have those little scanning machines. Like an officer had to type in the person's passport information and all that. And so prior to September 11th, a lot of people were getting into Canada with things on their records, and Canada just didn't know because we didn't have the detection methods that we do today. But now it's very rare that I hear of any ports of entry that don't have that kind of quick scanning technology.
Got you. Okay. I think that's really all the questions I have, unless there's anything else that you want to add.
I just wanted to mention that we do offer free consultations on this. So if like you're not sure and you're just wondering, you can definitely call my office. I'll give you the toll-free number, and maybe we'll write it below as well.
We'll insert it into the description. Yes.
It's 1-855-316-3555, and you can get a free consultation where you'll discuss in my office with somebody about everything that's on your record and have all your questions answered about what's likely to happen when you arrive at the Canadian border.
And we are also going to include, I think they're going to come up on the left-hand side here, a couple of videos from Marissa's channel so that you can explore. She has a very fun infographic. I think it's an infographic video, like a cartoon video, explaining in detail. It's very short. It's very informative about what we discussed here today with how to get temporary visas and how to other ways to get into Canada with respect to expungement and all that. So we're going to include those on the left-hand side here. I thank you all for joining us. This has been a pleasure, Marissa. I really appreciate you joining us here today. I'll also include a link to Marissa's YouTube channel in the description below. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you.